If you would like early access to my videos, please subscribe to my Patreon. Looking over the world today, we are struck by the gap that exists between rich and poor nations. One unmistakable element of this gap are differences in technology. While some countries produce vehicles, electronics, and chemicals, others produce little more than raw materials and agricultural products. How did this state of affairs come about? Human history has always been marked by the evolution of technology. Over thousands of years, innovations like the sailboat, the water wheel, the compass, paper, coinage, and more transformed the organization of human activity and society. But it wasn't until the onset of the Industrial Revolution, starting in England in the early 19th century, that technological development in one part of the world reached a breakneck pace. This development was motivated by the logic of capitalism as an economic system, wherein the bourgeoisie, the new ruling class, sought the infinite expansion of their wealth through continuous investment and reinvestment in profitable ventures. With the use of modern patents and innovation of previous centuries, research and development of new technologies became a method of making profit as well. Their efforts transformed the whole of society around them. In their rush to undermine their competitors, the bourgeoisie raced against each other to invest in and deploy these new technologies. Giant textile machines which could produce cloth faster and better than artisanal manufacturers. New and faster ships powered by steam. The telegraph, which made near instantaneous communication across vast distances possible for the first time. Railroads crisscrossed the land, carrying numbers of goods and people at such a rate that would have previously only been possible to transport by ship. The bourgeoisie then turned their eyes abroad to notions of empire which had existed prior to industrial capitalism. Through empire, the bourgeoisie sought to obtain the raw materials necessary for their manufacturing industries at home, as well as force open new markets for their goods abroad. Thus capitalism, empire, and technological development intertwined to further entrench Europe's dominion across the world. In 1800, Europe controlled little territory in Africa and Asia. But by the dawn of the 20th century, almost all of Africa and large swaths of Asia would fall under direct European domination. With the arrival of the Europeans followed their coveted technologies. Railroads and telegraphs now spread across Asia and Africa. Steamships rapidly crossed key trade routes in a fraction of the previous standard time. These key transportation and communication technologies connected the world in an unprecedented way. It was the beginning of the massively interconnected global system of trade that defines the modern world economy. The Europeans described themselves as taking on a civilizing mission. Introducing such technologies was argued to be a part of that mission, but a closer examination of the way these technologies were introduced to the Global South reveals that the installation of these technologies had more to do with the needs of the colonial authorities than the indigenous populations. Take the telegraph. In fact, the geography of the first attempted submarine telegraph cables can tell us quite a lot. The first 3 submarine telegraph cables to link separate continents prior to 1870 or the cable linking Europe to the United States, the cross-Mediterranean cable which linked France to Algeria, and a submarine cable linking Britain to India. The priority given to these latter two cables by the two greatest imperial powers of that age demonstrates the extent to which they valued near-instantaneous communication with their most important colonies. Prior to the 1840s, a message between Britain and India would have traveled 5 to 8 months by boat. Even after the introduction of steamships carrying mail across international sea lanes, the voyage would still take 6 weeks in either direction. But by the end of the 19th century, Europe's telegraph lines would truly span the globe, and a message from the metropole in Europe could easily and quickly travel to any imperial army in the world. The steam engine is another pivotal technology introduced to the colonies by Europe, and here too we can find evidence of Europe's intentions in the way this technology was applied. Take a look at this map of major British railroads in the late 19th century. What we can see is a web of railways which connect major cities, ports, and resource-rich areas together in an organic way. A map of the African railroads in 1914 offers a stark contrast. Here we can see sparsely connected railroads that start at the ports and reach deep into the interior, where raw materials were located. This is an extractive pattern. The materials of the African hinterland were loaded onto trains and sent along to the ports, where they boarded ships bound for Europe. Let us continue our examination of colonial patterns and infrastructure. In a map of the world's telegraph lines compiled by the International Telecommunications Union in 1903, we find the same pattern as the railways, a dense network connecting towns, villages, and cities in the European countries, and sparser networks connecting the ports to the hinterlands within the colonies. Why did Europe not grant its technology to the rest of the world without restriction as it claimed it intended to? Because as master of the world, Europe was in a position to restructure it in any way it desired. And what Europe desired was dictated by powerful economic interests. Capitalists were driven by the structure of their economic system to make endless profits. Their vehicle for doing so was the production of commodities. Whether that commodity was a submarine telegraph cable or a steam engine or a cotton shirt, the bourgeoisie were singularly focused on using these commodities to turn a profit on their investment. Nothing else mattered. The more commodities they produced and sold, the higher their profits would be. If others were able to adopt these technologies and produce them as commodities as well, the commodities produced by these new competitors would saturate the market and drive down the price of the commodity. Obviously, this would jeopardize the ability of the bourgeoisie to make profits. Remember also that this was a world where intellectual property existed and ideas were themselves already conceived of as valuable property. The unconditional transfer of technology was thus unthinkable. Europe therefore took steps to prevent its colonial holdings from catching up. Contrary to Europe's proclaimed civilizing mission, European capitalists had no intention of giving away their technological secrets. The technology of Europe would remain nestled in its capitalist firms. It's important to note that prior to the Paris Convention, which was the first international law on intellectual property rights, or any strong notion of intellectual property rights, countries had long sought to prevent the transfer of technology from their own control. Venice's patent laws of the 15th century existed alongside laws preventing, for example, glass workers from sharing their know-how in other countries under penalty of death. In the early 1780s, no skilled British artisan or manufacturer was allowed to leave the British Empire, and textile workers weren't even allowed to leave the British Isles. Furthermore, Britain banned the export of any pre-industrial or industrial textile, metalworking, clockmaking, leatherworking, papermaking, or glass manufacturing equipment until the 1840s. This was a tactic to limit technological transfer to adversary countries. But in the colonies, Europe controlled far more than what was exported to them. They controlled the very government which ruled over their colonial subjects. In this context, Europe did not need to enforce laws on intellectual property within its colonies. Instead, it limited the transfer of technology by undermining the material basis of such a transfer. When we think about technology, what immediately comes to mind are the physical manifestations of that technology. The steam engine, the telegraph, the steamboat, these are all physical things which exist in the physical world. But we must remember that technology is ultimately rooted in ideas and in human beings who can act on those ideas and bring them into existence. There isn't a technology in human history, from the most rudimentary stone hammer to the most sophisticated microchip, that didn't begin its life as an idea in the mind of a human being. And those same physical manifestations of technology would rust away without the maintenance of human beings who understand them. Human technology is thus ultimately rooted in the human mind. Accordingly, any transfer of technology is a transfer of ideas, and any transfer of ideas requires a human population which has developed the intellectual capacity through education to receive those ideas. So we now must ask the question, what kind of education did the imperial powers of Europe offer to their colonial subjects? For most of the time Europe occupied Asia and Africa, the answer would be very little. The colonial powers of Europe kept statistics on their colonies, including on education. The validity of these statistics are contested, but I would like to show you some alongside the statistics of the home countries in Europe. We'll start with the statistics on primary education, the lowest level of education one can receive, and roughly equivalent to an elementary school. You might be surprised to see that the Congo has a higher enrollment rate than Portugal, one of the European empires under examination. I'd like to make 2 points here about the data. First is that these statistics were collected by different governments using different methodologies. So in these charts, it's not always clear if comparisons between countries and different empires are applicable. That being said, Portugal was significantly less developed at this time than the other European powers, and this will come up in later statistics as well. Leaving that aside, we can see that with the exception of Belgium, primary school enrollment was in every case significantly lower in the colonies than in the metropole. This is a pattern we can see throughout the different levels of schooling. Moving on to secondary education, we can see the difference is even more stark. While in the UK, 3,966 persons were enrolled in school for every 100,000 people in the population, that number was only 1,821 in Pakistan. Where France had enrollment of 1,884 persons, its nearest colony in terms of enrollment, Syria, had only 1,001. It only gets worse from here. In the Netherlands, enrollment is almost 9 times higher than Indonesia. Portugal's is more than 10 times that of Angola. Belgium's enrollment is 60 times that of the Congo. Even by their own statistics, the colonial powers were only providing a fraction of the educational development that was imparted in the home countries. Finally, we look at higher level education. Technology transfer demands people who understand the technology at the highest level. But here as well, we see the colonial powers documenting how little resources they devoted to educating their subjects. As I've already noted, these statistics are contested. Some believe the numbers for education in the colonies are inflated. Furthermore, the education available in the 1940s and 1950s was significantly higher than the norm over the duration of European colonization. As Walter Rodney wrote in his seminal work, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, a European-type school system hardly operated during the first 40 years or so of colonialism. In that period, missionaries gave schooling for their own Christianizing purposes, and it was in the 1920s that the colonizing powers carried out a series of investigations into educational possibilities in Africa. Thereafter, colonial education became systematic and measurable, though it approached its maximum dimensions only in the post-Second World War era. So we can think of these statistics as something of a best-case scenario. But even so, the narrative these numbers tell is clear. Unfortunately, they tell us nothing about the quality of education in the colonies, which was significantly worse than in the metropole. To gauge the educational levels of the colonies, we can look at illiteracy statistics. Literacy, defined as the ability to read and write a simple message, is a bare minimum that's required to do educated work. It's a primary building block on which the higher levels of educated work are based. In 1957, UNESCO commissioned a study estimating illiteracy in most world countries for the year 1950. This is again a year positioned directly before the era of decolonization, and can tell us much about the state the colonial powers left their former colonies in. Did the European powers leave their colonies in a condition where they could adopt cutting-edge technology? This graph seems to provide a conclusive answer. Whereas within the imperial core, with the exception of Portugal, the literacy was remarkably low. Among the colonies, none have an illiteracy rate lower than 60%. It is worth noting that even Portugal, seen as relatively backwards among European nations at the time, still has half the illiteracy rate of its African colonies. Since the UNESCO study offers ranges rather than exact percentages, for the imperial core I have chosen the upper bound estimate and for the colonies the lower bound estimate, giving once again the best possible presentation of the data for the imperial powers. These neglected populations amount to hundreds of millions of illiterate people, a tremendous burden which weighs on the global south to the present day. But even if the global south had been educated, a transfer of technology would require the existence of institutions within the recipient country which could accept that technology. In the colonies and under capitalism, these institutions would take the form of private or state-owned firms. But the colonial powers did not often build such firms within their colonies, and there would have been no motivation for them to do so. To build alternative firms within their colonies would have challenged the monopolistic stranglehold Europe held on these key technologies. As a result, when some technology appeared within the European colonies, it was generally carried there by a European firm with European employees at the highest technical levels. As Daniel Hedrick writes in his History of Technology Transfer between Europe and the Colonies, every time a new process or piece of equipment was introduced into a colony, it came with European experts to set it up and to operate it, and sometimes to pass their jobs on to their sons. How else can one explain that Europeans were still driving locomotives in India 90 years after the first railway was built? The Ackworth Committee, set up to investigate the railways in India in the aftermath of the First World War, remarked that, at the date of the last report, there are employed on the railways of India about 710,000 persons. Of these, roughly 700,000 were Indians and only 7,000 Europeans, a proportion of just 1%. But the 7,000 were like a thin film of oil on the top of a glass of water, resting upon but hardly mixing with the 700,000 below. None of the highest posts are occupied by Indians, very few even of the higher, that they have not been advanced to higher posts, that even in the subordinate posts of the official staff there are not more of them, has been a standing subject of complaint before us. Until recently, opportunities for the technical training of Indians were lacking, and in the absence of opportunities, naturally few Indians were able to reach the standard required for the superior posts. This hierarchical system was not just motivated by racism, it was because of a real fear that the colonized could pose an economic threat to European interests if educated. As British civil servant Alfred Chaddington explained in 1912, English manufacturers look upon Indian technical students as possible future competitors, and naturally they will extend to them none of the facilities or privileges without which experience cannot be gained. A few years later, the Morrison Committee on State Technical Scholarships reported that, in engineering, the metallurgical industries, and the manufacture of machinery, there should be little difficulty in normal times in securing the practical training required. But in other industries, the difficulties are much greater, and employers contend that the necessity of guarding their trade secrets and the fear of trade competition would prevent them from admitting Indian students to their works, even if they had plenty of work to do. Here we can see that the European firms in which technologies were situated were deeply unwilling to share them for fear of future competition. They saw the methods essential to the manufacture of modern technology as their valuable trade secrets. They thus jealously guarded their technological advantage. If you want to understand why European powers didn't impart their technology on the colonized, it is simply because there was no advantage to any of the relevant actors to do so. Thus, firms based in Europe, operated by European employees, would be the motive force behind the construction of railways, telegraphs, ports, mining operations, and other technological investments in the colonies. Though these infrastructure projects have been presented as gifts by the colonial powers to their subjects by certain apologists of colonialism, they were nothing of the sort. Being of Europe, these projects would always adhere to European interests. Sylvanus Olympio, the first president of the post-colonial African state of Togo, would describe the reality of such technological infrastructure in this manner. The effect of the policy of the colonial powers has been the economic isolation of peoples who live side by side, in some instances within a few miles of each other, while directing the flow of resources to the metropolitan countries. For example, although I can call Paris from my office telephone here in Lomé, I cannot place a call to Lagos in Nigeria, only 250 miles away. Again, while it takes a short time to send an airmail to Paris, it takes several days for the same letter to reach Accra, a mere 132 miles away. Railways rarely connect at international boundaries. Roads have been constructed from the coast inland, but very few join economic centers of trade. The productive central regions of Togo, Dahomey, and Ghana are as remote from each other as if they were on separate continents. To get an idea of what he means, take another look at the colonial railroad system in place in Africa by 1914. Now examine the railroad system in 2009, which is largely representative of the network today. The railway network that Africa inherited from Europe simply served to connect the resource-rich hinterland to ports. Today's infrastructure is in fact the same, an old colonial reality with a new veneer. At the dawn of the post-colonial era, this was the situation that the newly independent states of Africa and Asia were left with, and their tenure ruling over the majority of the world, the European empires had created a vast gap in technological development, one which would be used to create a relationship of dependency between the North and the South. And this dependency, created in the colonial era, would be utilized to recreate the economic patterns that were present under colonialism and carry them forward into the modern day. That's it for today's video, and in the next video we will continue our discussion of intellectual property, picking up where we left off in the last video, and we will explain how IP became a truly worldwide phenomenon. Until then, be sure to like and subscribe, and if you would like early access to my videos, or if you want to support my efforts, please subscribe to my Patreon.